For over 6 decades, the United States has maintained economic sanctions on Cuba, aiming to isolate the island nation politically and economically. However, as global dynamics shift, these sanctions are proving increasingly ineffective. The rise of BRICS, an economic bloc consisting of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has provided Cuba with new opportunities for trade, investment, and diplomatic alliances, weakening the impact of U.S. policies. A brief history of U.S. sanctions on Cuba. The U.S. first imposed an embargo on Cuba in 1960, following the Cuban Revolution and the nationalization of U.S.-owned properties on the island. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy expanded the sanctions into a full trade embargo, banning nearly all economic interactions between the two countries. The goal was to pressure the Cuban government into adopting democratic reforms and moving away from socialism. The declining effectiveness of U.S. sanctions. For decades, the U.S. sanctions created significant economic hardships for Cuba, restricting access to financial markets, limiting foreign investment, and cutting off trade opportunities. However, the effectiveness of these measures has been diminishing due to several key factors. 1. Globalization and alternative trade partners. The world economy has changed dramatically since the Cold War. While the U.S. once had a dominant influence over global trade and finance, new economic players have emerged. Countries like China, Russia, and Brazil have expanded their economic relationships with Cuba, allowing the island nation to bypass many of the restrictions imposed by the U.S. too. International opposition to sanctions. The U.S. embargo on Cuba is widely criticized by the international community. Every year, the United Nations General Assembly overwhelmingly votes in favor of resolutions condemning the sanctions, with only the U.S. and a few allies opposing. Even within the U.S., business groups and policymakers argue that the sanctions harm American economic interests more than they influence Cuban politics. 3. Cuba's economic reforms. In recent years, Cuba has implemented economic reforms to modernize its socialist economy. The government has allowed limited private enterprise, increased foreign investment, and developed sectors like tourism and biotechnology. These changes have made Cuba more resilient to external pressures and created new opportunities for engagement with non-U.S. partners. The role of BRICS in weakening U.S. sanctions. BRICS has emerged as a powerful counterbalance to U.S. influence in global politics and economics. Each member nation plays a unique role in strengthening Cuba's economic resilience. 1. China, Cuba's largest trading partner. China has become Cuba's most important economic partner, providing critical investments in infrastructure, telecommunications, and energy. Chinese companies have also supplied Cuba with essential goods, helping to offset the impact of U.S. trade restrictions. 2. Russia, a long-standing ally. Russia has maintained strong ties with Cuba since the Soviet era. In recent years, Moscow has provided economic aid, oil supplies, and military cooperation. Russia has also supported Cuba in international forums, opposing U.S. sanctions and advocating for deeper economic integration. 3. Brazil, agricultural and economic cooperation. Under President Lula da Silva, Brazil has increased economic cooperation with Cuba, particularly in agriculture and healthcare. Brazilian companies have invested in Cuban infrastructure, and the two nations have collaborated on food production and medical research. 4. India, expanding trade relations. India has strengthened its trade relations with Cuba, particularly in pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, and renewable energy. India's support has provided Cuba with essential medical supplies and technology, reducing its dependence on Western imports. 5. South Africa. political and diplomatic support. South Africa has historically supported Cuba, both diplomatically and economically. The two countries share strong political ties, and South Africa has provided aid and investment in various sectors, further helping Cuba withstand U.S. sanctions. The geopolitical shift away from U.S. dominance. The growing influence of BRICS is not just about Cuba. It represents a broader shift in global power dynamics. The U.S. has traditionally used economic sanctions as a tool to enforce its foreign policy objectives. However, the rise of alternative economic alliances is challenging this approach. 1. BRICS and the de-dollarization movement. One of the biggest challenges to U.S. sanctions is the BRICS initiative to reduce dependence on the U.S. dollar. By conducting trade in local currencies, BRICS nations are creating financial systems that are less vulnerable to U.S. restrictions. This has allowed Cuba to engage in trade without relying on dollar-based transactions. 2. Expanding BRICS membership. BRICS is expanding its influence by inviting new members, including countries in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. This growing coalition is creating new economic opportunities for nations targeted by U.S. sanctions, including Cuba. The declining power of U.S. sanctions as a foreign policy tool. As more countries find ways to bypass U.S. sanctions, the effectiveness of these measures is diminishing. What the future holds for Cuba and BRICS. With BRICS continuing to strengthen its economic and political influence, Cuba is likely to benefit from deeper integration into this global network. The key areas to watch include increased investment in Cuban infrastructure. China, Russia, and Brazil are likely to continue investing in Cuba's energy, transportation, and technology sectors. One of the primary reasons U.S. sanctions are losing their impact is the increasing globalization of trade. In the past, Washington's control over international financial institutions and trade networks allowed it to effectively isolate countries that defied its policies. However, BRICS nations have been developing parallel economic structures that reduce reliance on Western-controlled systems. China, for example, has become Cuba's largest trading partner, providing critical imports, infrastructure investment, and financial assistance. Russia, a longtime ally, has continued to supply Cuba with oil, military aid, and economic support, further reducing the effectiveness of U.S. sanctions. The international community has also played a role in undermining U.S. sanctions. For decades, the United Nations General Assembly has overwhelmingly condemned the embargo, with only the United States and a handful of allies supporting its continuation. Even within the U.S., there is growing opposition to the sanctions, particularly from business groups and lawmakers who see the policy as outdated and counterproductive. BRICS has played a particularly crucial role in challenging U.S. dominance and providing Cuba with alternatives. China, as the world's second-largest economy, has invested heavily in Cuba's infrastructure, telecommunications, and energy sectors. Russia has maintained strong political and economic ties with Havana, offering crucial assistance in times of crisis. Brazil, under the leadership of President Lula da Silva, has strengthened cooperation with Cuba in areas such as agriculture, healthcare, and trade.